Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I'm Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. Access to energy is fundamental to the realization of human rights and a prerequisite for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Yet, developing countries continue to face critical challenges in securing clean, affordable, reliable and sustainable energy. This is particularly true for Africa, a continent that lies at the heart of the global energy transition agenda. Despite its immense renewable energy potential, Africa receives a disproportionately small share of global energy investments. Now, this imbalance underscores the urgent need for equitable financial flows, ones that reflect both development imperatives and sustainability priorities in order to meet global climate objectives. These issues were at the forefront of discussions at the 11th G20 Parliamentary Speakers Summit, also known as the P20, where participants emphasized the need to balance energy security, climate action, and economic growth, guided by the principles of equity, sustainability, and climate justice. Held in Cape Town from the 1st to 3rd of October, the summit saw speakers and legislators from G20 countries call for equitable climate finance in energy transition, stressing that the global move from fossil fuels to renewable energy must happen fairly and inclusively, safeguarding the rights and interests of the vulnerable communities. Delegates urged greater investment in clean energy across developing nations, along with enhanced regional integration, technology transfer, and deployment of renewable solutions through global partnerships and initiatives. On the show today, we delve deeper into the key takeaways from this year's P20, exploring how equitable climate finance can drive a just and inclusive energy transition, a theme which is not only timely and relevant, but also vital for countries that are already grappling with the devastating impacts of climate change. Joining us on the program are two distinguished guests. So let me begin by introducing them to you. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome on the program today Ms. Ulka Kelkar, Executive Program Director, Climate, Economics and Finance, WRI India. Ms. Kelkar, thank you for your time. Welcome to Sansad TV. Also delighted to welcome Mr. Chandra Bhushan, Founder and CEO, International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology, iForest. Mr. Bhushan, thank you for your time. Welcome to the telecast. So let's start the conversation with you, Mr. Chandra Bhushan. At the P20 summit that took place in Cape Town at the start of this month, parliamentarians from various countries called for equitable climate finance and a just energy transition. Now, these are issues that were also central to India's G20 presidency back in 2023. How do you assess the progress made since those discussions 2 years ago, both within India but also in the global context?
Thank you for having me on your show, Reena. First of all, the range of issues that India's G20 came out with was unprecedented. We addressed almost all important issues, from finance to technology to shared digital infrastructure. A range of issues which matters today was addressed, discussed and finalized during India G20. However, since then, things have not been that optimistic. The reason being the backtracking of commitment of some of the developed countries. US has, for example, walked out of the Paris Agreement now. It is not going to contribute anything as far as climate finance is concerned. We also see some sort of dampening of ambition from Europe. Europe is not providing the kind of ambition, putting out the kind of ambition it once had on climate issues. So as far as climate finance is concerned, and especially from African perspective, this is a very important issue because the cost of capital in Africa is extremely high. If you go to Tanzania, for example, and you want to set up a solar panel in Dar es Salaam, you will have to pay an interest rate of 20% plus annually. Right. Think about in India, we pay about 10%. By the time you are in Europe, you are paying an interest rate of few percentage, 4 to 5%. So for Africa, equitable climate finance is extremely important for energy transition because of the sheer the cost of capital that African nation today has to pay for energy transition, adapt to climate change. They have contributed, in fact, least to climate, even much lower than what India has contributed to climate change. And still, they have to pay a very high price for adaptation as well as for energy transition. So unfortunately, things are not moving in the right direction. While the declaration of P20 is very encouraging, but unfortunately, the situation on the ground is much more different. The encouraging aspect is that renewable energy investment is growing because it is becoming competitive. In India, for example, this year we will be installing the highest amount of renewable ever in our history. Right. Renewables are real. They are competing with traditional source of energy, and they will become much more cheaper. Similar transition we see in electric vehicle as well. So on some technological, transition, for example, renewable and electric vehicles, the world is doing better because market has caught on. It is now economically viable and profitable to invest in this, but only in countries like India. It is still not that profitable and economically viable to invest large scale in some of the African countries. And that's where equitable finance is very important.
Clearly. So how can we ensure that we do not leave anyone behind? Ms. Kelkar, every year, this was the 11th P20 Summit, every year the outcome document is extremely encouraging, calling on global stakeholders to come together and work on the challenges. And that's where we also heard at the 11th P20 this year, strong calls were made for equitable and fair financing for the energy transition to happen. So assertions from speakers right from Africa to Australia talking about a just and inclusive energy transition. But when we look at the progress, something that Mr. Bhushan also pointed out, it's not that encouraging. Tell us and our viewers what, according to you, are the key barriers that are preventing the global energy transitions from being truly just and inclusive and sustainable?
Thanks very much. I think there are two aspects to this. One is that the just energy transition requires a huge amount of money. Right now, a lot of it is coming from public funds, that is from government budgets. So if you look at, for example, transportation, clean transportation, the bulk of it is coming, like almost, I would say 90% of it is coming from government budgets. But if you look at the amounts of money that are needed, we have a Baku to Belém roadmap of $1.3 trillion required per year. About 10% of that is needed by India, $50 billion to $150 billion. This can't come from public government budgets alone. It has to come from the private sector. Right. And unfortunately, the private sector looks for the profit motive. So sectors which are around distributed renewable energy, or micro, small and medium enterprises, or resilient infrastructure, renewables application in agriculture and water, for example, is not seen as profitable enough. So there needs to be much more leveraging of private finance by using public funds cleverly, strategically, and by reducing the risk perception so that the cost of capital that Chandrabhushan talked about can be moderated. The second part of it is that it is not only about reducing emissions or switching to clean energy. It is also has to be about jobs, livelihoods, and making access to skilling and to finance available for the youth that are entering the workforce, for the women who are trying to enter the workforce, and for small businesses who are trying to actually make sure that the clean energy transition is also an economic opportunity for them. So that's why there is a need also for philanthropic funding to come in, and for development aid, which has been actually cut back by Western countries as they try to increase defense spending, for that development aid to be directed towards climate-friendly activities. So that when you have electric mobility, for example, it is not only about manufacturing electric vehicles, but also electric vehicle charging can become, for instance, a job opportunity for women, not just in urban areas, but also in rural areas. So this is really the entire package that needs to be put together. And it's wonderful that the parliamentarians of these G20 countries are coming together because they have a lot of resources at their disposal, but they also have the ability to set laws and regulations that send long-term signals to private industry and private investors that the energy transition is here to stay and they should invest in it.
Clearly. So we will delve deeper into how these documents can be translated into outcomes and the progress can be tracked. But since you spoke about the complexities and the global climate finance architecture, let me ask you about what innovative mechanisms do you think? There was something called the solidarity levies that was mentioned at the P20 by one of the speakers. In context of that, what other innovative ideas do you think could be realistic tools going forth to realize or mobilize large-scale funds?
Certainly. I think there are 2 or 3 types of things that can be done. One, the example that you mentioned, is trying to raise additional resources. For example, business class travel, luxury travel, that could be taxed at a higher rate. Other kinds of things can also be done. For example, any kind of international shipping or internet use or any kinds of new types of transactions which are not basic survival economic transactions, but really are things that are luxury goods which we can afford to add a 1% or a 2% levy on it. Those are the kinds of things that could be used to raise additional funds. That is one. The other is that whatever funding is there, it should be mainstreamed towards climate action. That is, for example, if a new transport infrastructure needs to be built or a new energy infrastructure needs to be built in developing countries to meet the growing energy needs of the global south, then there is a choice between building a new fossil-based electricity supply or a non-fossil-based electricity supply, or doing things in a centralized way or doing things in a decentralized way. So there is always an opportunity to mainstream climate considerations into the tenders or the criteria for any new project. And the third is really that a lot of local funding which is available. Just to give an example, every mining district in the country does set aside some funds called a district mineral foundation. Every construction project that happens in any city sets aside some funds for construction workers. Can these kinds of funds be used to support the livelihoods of those who will be affected by these energy transitions, so that they can also be skilled, they can also be compensated, and they can also be supported to become more resilient? I think the last aspect is really something that a lot of people are trying to come up with different types of blended instruments where you have small amounts of public finance available, but it can be used to leverage large amounts of private capital, provided that there is a backing of the government that says that if there are any kinds of regulatory risks of long-term policy changes or any kinds of contractual risks, for example, the tariff might change, that kind of guarantee will be provided by the government, so that for the private investor, particularly the foreign investor, this starts looking like a durable, like a safe investment, and they're incentivized.
Absolutely. So how can climate finance also be used to empower, say, different groups and at the same time generate jobs is something that we'll come to. But Mr. Chandrabhushan, first talking about the reforms that the climate finance architecture needs to undergo, because clearly the existing mechanisms aren't sufficient enough given the challenges that the world faces, and especially the developing countries that are more vulnerable. What, according to you, how can multilateral development banks, the global financial institutions, reform their existing models to better serve the developing countries, most of whom are in the global south?
See, one of the tragedy of global financial system is the way sovereign rating is done. Countries which are likely to be worst impacted by climate change will get the worst rating because the risk is high. So the current financial architecture is designed as risk and reward under risk and reward framework, which is problematic in a world where climate is changing rapidly.
Ms. Kelkar, let's continue with you.
The question that you've asked is really something that goes to the heart of the matter. That is, how can this massive transition that is happening, how can it be good not just for the climate, but also for people? And also, while we're at it, for the natural resources on which people in our part of the world still depend for their livelihoods. And I think there is a lot that we can learn from each other. India has actually handed over the G20 presidency to South Africa. And one of the early examples from South Africa of the shutting down of the Komati power plant and the kinds of learnings that we have done from that, how much funding is coming, what is the nature of the funding, is it loans or is it grants, what is that funding being used for? If people lose their jobs and they start getting skilled, but the next set of new green jobs is not ready, then how can their families be supported? All of this early learning is something that is really going to be very helpful as this transition scales up. So in India, also many states, for example, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, West Bengal, many public sector utilities like Coal India, NTPC, ONGC, many of these really are trying to put in place studies as well as best practices by consulting with different stakeholders on how do you prepare. If this transition is something that we have a few years to plan for in a very responsible, careful way, then how can we take along all of the communities and the civil society organizations that work in these areas? I'll just give you a couple of simple examples. For example, we are working in the Surat textile cluster. And over here, when a new technology comes, the technology may actually help to save energy. It may help to save water. And by saving energy and water, it actually pays back for itself. But the new technology might need fewer people. Where 4 people were needed earlier to run the machine, maybe now 2 people are needed. So what do? Do you lay off those 2 people? No, there are examples where these people are being reskilled and they're being accommodated in a different part of the value chain. So I think that's the kind of activity that will be needed. And a huge part of this has to be the government skilling agencies. But equally important is the role of the large companies, the global buyers, the original equipment manufacturers. They also need to support the small enterprises that are the suppliers and vendors in their supply chains. I think if we take this kind of approach, also include the corporate social responsibility that supports the communities around a manufacturing unit or around a power plant, then we can make sure that the transition is good, not just from a technological or environmental point of view, but also from a livelihood and social point of view.
So this is the pathway to ensure the just energy transition that we have been discussing. Taking on now from the interventions that Ms. Kelkar has made, Mr. Chandrabhushan, 2 parts to the next question that I have for you. First, about how climate finance can be used to not just reduce emissions, but at the same time protect jobs, promote equity, promote gender inclusion, and most importantly, local empowerment. And the second aspect, it relates to sharing the best practices. So in that context, what lessons can India share from its own experiences in, say, renewable energy expansion, something in which we've made remarkable progress, also rural electrification, and most importantly, community level adaptation?
So, Reena, as I was saying that I think let's look at this challenge at different levels. At global level, we will have to bring fairness in financial system itself. I'm not talking about climate finance. And there is a fundamental problem in global financial system. And as I was saying, that the more vulnerable you are likely to pay higher for the cost of capital because of the way risk and reward system has been organized in the financial system. The sovereign rating, for example, of developing countries are going to deteriorate further and further in the current system because they are more vulnerable to climate change. Therefore, they will have to pay more for the cost of capital. So I think one important thing which came out of India G20 was how do we reform and make the global financial system fairer? And I think that is the biggest agenda as far as finance is concerned. Developed countries are not going to pay public fund to developing countries. This has been a 30 years of experience on climate finance. They pledge, they renege on that pledge, and then we keep asking that you need to pay us more because it is climate equity. This Belem, the Baku to Belem roadmap of 1.3 trillion is also not going to materialize. So I think we need to be realistic. What is going to happen globally on climate finance? So I think the agenda for developing countries, especially for countries of Africa, is to demand serious reform in the global financial system. So that is first. At the national level, I think the best practices are still emerging. I think we are still grappling with the challenges of just transition. We are understanding on on this is not very clear. We do a lot of work and research on just transition, but I think the rapidity with which this transition has to take place has never happened in history of humanity. Okay, we have moved from bullock cart to automobile in 200 years. We have moved from wood to coal in 150 years. Now we are trying to change the entire energy system of the world in 30, 40 years. So one, the scale, we are now 8 billion people. We are consuming much more energy than ever. So the scale as well as speed in 3 decades is going to be very challenging. So I think the best practice will emerge. There are some best practices that are emerging from other parts of the world. We have to learn from other parts of the world, but I think developing countries will have to find its own way as far as best practices are concerned. Mainstreaming gender is very important. We have done some work on skilling, for example, and we are finding that is the education, STEM, science and technology education is going to be very, very important for gender mainstreaming in the way we are looking at climate change. So these are much bigger issues, but these are things that we will have to address.
And I think this is where the parliaments, the legislators, the policymakers will play a key role. So we touched upon this aspect, but just to understand in greater detail, know your perspectives on how the parliaments of every country, those who play a key role in decision making, how can they strengthen the oversight? How can they ensure a transparent allocation of climate funds? Ms. Kelkar?
Thank you. I think the parliamentarians have a lot of different avenues by which they can make sure that they can play their part in this just and equitable transition. One is to do a comprehensive plan for their constituency or the part of the country that they represent. So this is something where you can bring in the kinds of energy that is needed, the way livelihoods can be supported, the policies that currently exist on the ground, and how additional finance can be brought in. So all of this can be built into a comprehensive plan, whether it's for the rural area or whether it's for the urban area. In India, for example, we have climate action plans for mega cities like Bangalore and Mumbai, but we also have comprehensive district plans for environmental issues. And this is something that feeds into the funding processes of rural development banks like NABARD in India. The second is that every parliamentarian also has a pool of discretionary funding. And some parliamentarians, for example, have used their MP local area development funds to promote rooftop solar. This can create a really important signaling effect. You know, when people see rooftop solar being deployed, for example, on rural schools or hospitals, then they feel motivated to also explore if this is something that might be economically viable for them as well. The third is that if parliamentarians can raise questions in parliament, but also set standards or mandates that can signal to the private sector that the government is really supporting or backing the clean energy transition in a long-term way, then private investment will flow into these areas. And finally, the de-risking aspect. That is, if there can be a government backing, then there can be a way to combat this issue of the cost of capital. In India, one particular process that is ongoing is the Finance Commission process, the 16th Finance Commission. And this is a way in which every Finance Commission brings in a formula or tweaks a formula to incentivize environmental action. Previously, they have incentivized states to protect forests. This time around, they can incentivize states to go more for clean energy or to invest more in climate adaptation. So there are really many different avenues by way of which parliamentarians can play their part in supporting the clean and equitable energy transition.
In fact, efforts towards that have been consistently made. We've begun to see progress as well at the national level. But Mr. Chandrabhushan, how can India continue to play a leadership role as a voice of the global south, something that we tried during our G20 presidency? But the key area here is in bridging the gap between climate ambition and climate justice.
The Indian experience has been a very important experience for a large number of developing countries, both in terms of governance, in terms of technology. For example, I always give this example that Bureau of Indian Standards, which people don't talk a lot about, the standards that Bureau of India, the BIS enacts are adopted by a large number of developing countries. Okay? So the Indian experience has been a very important experience because we reflect the realities of many developing countries, especially in Africa. So our experience in energy transition, for example, renewable energy is going to be extremely valuable, both distributed as well as large-scale deployment. Some of the African countries will require scalable renewable solutions like we are doing now. Some will require distributed, which we have experience of. For example, solar pump program of India is going to be extremely important, lesson for many developing countries. So I think one, that we need to ensure that our experience is shared. Second, we have to ensure that our standards, for example, solar standards, EV standards, the way we are designing our financial systems are also shared with other developing countries. Lastly, I think that India itself, we have done reasonably well, and I'm using this term reasonably well advisedly. We have done reasonably well on renewables so far, but we need to do a lot ourselves. You talked about parliamentarians. We do not have actually a law on climate change. India doesn't have a law to look at various aspects of climate change. Is something that Indian parliamentarians should look very carefully and seriously. Similarly, there are areas where it is expensive to invest, and that's where I think Government of India need to make that investment, which is adaptation. I think adaptation, with the kind of destruction we have seen this year in Himalayas, we need to get really serious about adaptation funding and building resilience in our ecosystem. So these are areas where India will have to work, but I think Indian experience is going to be critical for many developing countries.
You're right. There are so many avenues in which both of you have highlighted how India can leverage its experience from its own policy approach over the last few years to also the experience that it has gained from its G20 presidency in shaping the future global frameworks for green finance. To wrap up the conversation, as we move from pledges to practice, the challenge before the global community is not just to mobilize finance, but to ensure that the finance flows where it is needed the most, which means enabling a transition that's not only green, but also just, inclusive and fair, something that the P20 touched upon and something where the outcome has to be reflected if the global community works together. That's what the document was all about, but now collective action will be required in these areas. With that, we'll have to wrap up the program. Thank you once again to both my guests for joining us on the show today, sharing your perspective with us and our viewers. And to you viewers, thank you very much for your time as well.
To watch more programs of Sansad TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to like and share them.